want to add my thanks to everybody, to Anna and Brian, and though I've known them for a long time, it's the first time I've been able to address this group and feel very honored, especially after the quality of the lectures I've heard the last couple of days. Wonderful to be here. I do expect most of you have been to the Frick and know it's one of the finest collections of European art from the Renaissance through the 19th century and one of the most distinguished houses in New York. Henry Clay Frick asked for a simple house with light and air, and he got that. Plus, it's perhaps best known for its interiors, and I think the quality that people admire the most about the Frick is that it retains the sense of a private house. So, unlike, say, the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum or the Barnes, we have no strictures about leaving art in place. We can move things where we want at will, but this is one of those rooms that we don't touch because it's a sort of perfect expression of the taste of Frick, with a pair of Holbeins across the fireplace with a El Greco above, a slight touch of humor that Frick placed Sir Thomas More to the left, facing off with Thomas Cromwell in a kind of parable of power as one executed the other and then was executed in turn. But it's the mix of things which I think is so redolent of the atmosphere of American collectors at their best in the beginning of the 20th century. French 18th century furniture, Chinese porcelain, Italian Renaissance bronzes, Middle Eastern carpets, a kind of mix that is really more intuitive than most American museums, which tend to show things by school. And of course, it's not an encyclopedic museum. It's the taste, particularly of one man, and his daughter, who figures into the story later, and I'll talk about her. So he liked portraits. So Holbein, Sir Thomas More, 1527, Rembrandt, a late, great self-portrait of 1658, wonderful Velázquez of Philip IV, 1644. So each a great painting by one of the great painters. Frick insisted on having great provenance, great condition, and great quality. There are things he didn't like, of course. So he didn't particularly like still lifes. We don't have a lot of them. He didn't like religious art. Fortunately for us, he did buy this one picture, one of the greatest Italian Renaissance pictures in America, Giovanni Bellini's St. Francis in the Wilderness, where you see the saint at his sort of monastic community at La Verna, where he's moved in 1231, sort of stepping forward from his little arbor study to greet the dawn and to receive the stigmata. Really one of the most brilliant Italian pictures in America. But Frick was not a religious man, and in fact it's his daughter, Helen Clay, who really built up the early Italian Renaissance pictures that we're now known for. So how did he arrive at this place? He had a fairly modest beginning. He was born in 1849 in western Pennsylvania, a little town called West Overton. This is the family house. His father was an immigrant farmer. His mother's family was a little bit more prosperous. They had a hardware store, a flour distribution business, and a distillery, Old Overholt, which was founded by Frick's grandfather, Abraham Overholt, in 1810. Bartenders at the Frick still know to hand me a glass of Old Overholt when a reception starts at the Frick, so I can toast Henry's health. It's not the best of rye whiskeys, but it's tolerable, and it's still made. So this is sort of where he got his start. He was a bookkeeper there for 2 years, but he had the foresight to recognize the importance of coke in American industries, particularly in the making of steel and iron. Coke is processed coal. In western Pennsylvania, there's some of the greatest mines, veins of coal. And so it's coal that's been heated in an oven and therefore afterwards can achieve the high temperatures necessary for making iron and steel. So you see him there, 1870, age 21, not a man you want to tangle with, and the kind of dirty business that he was involved with. There was in order to expand his business, his family staked him initially to some money to begin it. The Mellon Bank sent a representative to interview him around this date, around 1870, and he got his loan. But the report came back that Frick may be a little too interested in pictures, but not enough to hurt, which has a certain irony because years later he was paying record prices for some of the greatest works of art. So what did this inspector see? He saw on the coal fields a small shack that was part office, part living hall, that was covered with prints and drawings. We don't know what they were, unfortunately, but from the earliest stage, Frick was already, he did some drawing himself, he was already collecting on a very modest level. Within 10 years, the factory had grown. He had 12,000 ovens to produce Coke. He had a monopoly of 80% of the Coke in the world and was tremendously successful, began to make a lot of money, and eventually joined Carnegie's business, and I'll get back to that later. He lived in bachelor apartments in what was relatively fashionable address, Monongahela House in downtown Pittsburgh, which he began to fill with some decorative arts and paintings and drawings. This is his first documented purchase of a painting by an artist you've probably never heard of. His name is George Hetzel, American, Pennsylvania landscape artist. This dates 1880. The bill of sale, you can see, make sure I don't turn this off, but delivered to Monongahela House where he was living on Mellon's Bank. So it sort of comes together, this portrait of him at the time. And the thing about Frick that's rather surprising is for the first 30 years of his life, he collects contemporary art. It really isn't until about 1900 that he starts shifting to old masters. So I think it's really sort of key to think about this as we look at his developing taste, because by the time he collected the group of works of art that we know at the Frick, he'd already been collecting for 30 years. He had developed an eye, he knew the dealers, he knew quality, but it really was American art and soon after French and English art that drew his attention. As I said, we don't really know what the prints and drawings on this shack office he had in 1870 were, but this is something he bought a little bit later. It's a Millet of 1866, Flight of Crows, drawing in pastel. This is the kind of thing which he was aspiring to, and representative of his collection. He knew artists. He actually would spend the summer with a man named Thomas Woodwell, who was an artist outside of Boston. He would visit artists in Europe. So he really, in fact, was quite friendly with the artistic communities. So he marries Adelaide Childs, 1881. They start a family immediately. On the left is a photograph dated 1883 of Frick with his one and only son, Childs, and then on the right is Adelaide with Childs, a little bit older. This is dated 1888. The girl to the right is Martha, who dies a few years later, and the baby is Helen Clay Frick, who figures in our story quite importantly. Why mothers insist on putting sons in kilts, I don't know, but my mother put me in a kilt of just about exactly the same age, and I've never quite understood it, though my father was Scottish. So the family grows. They have already bought a house in a suburb of Pittsburgh called Breeze Point. It's about 6 miles from downtown. As the family grows, they remodel it here in 1892. A kind of local society architect named Fred Osterling, who worked for people like William Schaub, Westinghouse, Mellon. You have to remember that Pittsburgh at this time was one of the wealthiest, one of the most dynamic cities in America. People sort of tend to forget that now, but some of the great business names of America came out of Pittsburgh at this time. So they remodeled this into a larger house, which is still there today. It's called Clayton, and it is part of the Frick Art and Historical Museum, though they've recently taken to calling themselves Frick Pittsburgh, so when you Google Frick, they come up very quickly after us. It's been remodeled, but this is a photograph from about 1900. So again, you can see the kinds of things he's collecting, mostly Barbizon school. This is the Millet I showed you earlier. There's Théodore Rousseau, Corot. So he moves on from American increasingly to sort of French and British art, but again, essentially contemporary art. Osterling remodels the house, and it's recently been renovated. So this photograph is after that renovation, but it's what in America we call aesthetic movement, American aesthetic movement, with cupboards, display cases that are full of English porcelain mostly, Copeland, Minton, Royal Worcester, for daily use for the most part, Gorham, and Tiffany silver. Most of the furniture is by a well-known New York, Boston-based company called Kimball, but all of a piece, a kind of unified design that this man Osterling made for Frick. But again, it's all contemporary of the period. And so finally we get to Carnegie and Frick. So Frick had his business, the monopoly of Coke. Carnegie had an iron and steel business and needed a steady supply of Coke, and Frick had the most and the best. So in 1882, Carnegie brings Frick into the business. And it turns out that Frick's also a managerial genius, which means he can squeeze every penny out of the factory, but also out of workers. So there's an infamous moment in 1892 when there's a strike at one of their factories near Pittsburgh. Carnegie is kind of conveniently off at his mansion in Scotland, so Frick is left to do the hard work. Frick tries to get the governor to bring in the National Guard. That doesn't happen, so he brings in Pinkerton men, and there are shots fired, and 7 lives are lost. As a result of this, newspapers in America refer to Frick as the most hated man in America. Shortly after that, a man named Alexander Berkman comes down from New York to try to assassinate Frick, bursts into his office, shoots him twice, stabs him. Frick still wrestles him to the ground, and he's sent to prison. Frick then writes a telegram to his wife and his business partner saying, "Shot twice, am fine, back at work." So the robber barons were tough men, one has to say, but art was certainly his redeeming feature and where he found the most pleasure in life. So you're looking at 2 portraits of these men around the same time by an artist named Théobald Chartrain. The portrait of Carnegie on the left, dating 1895, with Carnegie looking rather dreamily out into the distance, and Frick, clearly the worker bee, the desk piled with papers, a portrait from 1896. So the strike and the way that it plays out leads eventually to a rupture between these 2 men who had a tremendously successful run as businessmen. And Carnegie tries to push Frick off the board, and to do so paying him what his stock was worth when he entered the company rather than 20 years later. So Frick quite naturally objected. He brought a lawsuit. He won his lawsuit. So he leaves the company. He continues to have many business interests, particularly in railroads and so on. And he leaves Pittsburgh, and he moves to New York, staying first in Sherry's Hotel, and eventually he finds and rents this house, which is on Fifth Avenue. It was built for William H. Vanderbilt, 1880s, and then passed to his son, George Washington Vanderbilt, whom you may know from Biltmore fame, a sort of great house in North Carolina. So George Washington Vanderbilt rents this house to Frick for $50,000 a year, a lot of money. Edith Wharton, the novelist and one of the great tastemakers of America during this period, refers to this building as the Thermopylae of bad taste, referencing the catastrophic ancient Greek battle. But this is where Frick lives quite happily for most of the time that he's in New York, because he moves in here in 1905, and his house that you know isn't finished until 1914. So for almost 10 years, he lives here. This is an image of the salon in the house a little earlier, before Frick moved in. It dates around 1880. But it must have caught Frick's imagination because he had prints made of almost all the pictures which he had framed and put in his Pittsburgh house in Clayton. So as he's beginning to amass his collection, it's in this room that he's beginning to put it together. So he's renting a house in New York. He wants a summer house, and so he builds a house called Eagle Rock, which is in a town named Pride's Crossing. It's near Gloucester, outside of Boston. Uses a well-known Boston architectural firm, Little Brown. It's a 110-room house, and so he mostly summers here. It was torn down by his daughter in 1969, never quite figured out why. It's perched beautifully on cliffs overlooking the coast. And it's here where he amasses, part of his collection. This is where Joseph Duveen enters the story a bit. Duveen begins to help Frick in decorating some of the 110 rooms. And there are some tolerably good pictures, Reynolds. This is actually quite a good Coates. But what's interesting is, quite clearly in Frick's history, his collecting history, he keeps his earliest collection in Clayton in Pittsburgh, his more contemporary works. He keeps his sort of second string works in this house. And the very best objects he moves down to New York. So, they're not bad pictures. This is a pair of coats, Sir Griffith and Lady Boynton of 1767 and 68, I believe. They descended in the family. We've shown them recently at the Frick. They're not Gainsborough, but they're some of Coates's best pictures. I'd be very happy to have them. But it's just to make the point that he's very selective, what he decides to bring back to New York from this summer house. So he still doesn't have his own house, which he aspires to, but he falls in love with a property on what's now called Carnegie Hill. You hardly notice it's a hill anymore in New York City. And so he buys this property in 1907. As you can see, it had a structure on it already, the Lenox Library. And so he waits. It's a private library. At this point in New York's history, the New York Public Library is being formed, mostly from private libraries that come together. So Frick waits for 5 years until the books leave to go down to 42nd Street. Then he offers the city of New York to move this anywhere at once. After waiting for 9 months and not hearing anything, he says, all right, that's off. So he takes down this building. It's a very nice building by Richard Morris Hunt, and builds this building. Using the very architects who were building the New York Public Library, Carrera and Hastings, one of the best firms in the city at the time. And what he told them was that he wanted a simple, modest house in good taste and not ostentatious. When this was finished in 1914, the architectural magazine said, the most costly and sumptuous house in America has been turned over to its owners. So there's a certain discrepancy in what Frick was imagining he was going to get and how the rest of the world viewed it. And what is also important to know about the Frick is the role of decorators. each of the principal 2 floors had a decorator. So in this case, you're looking at a picture on some transatlantic voyage of the 1930s of Sir Charles Allam of the decorating firm Allam White, who on his reference sheet could list King George V because he'd recently done some work at Buckingham Palace, so that seemed to satisfy Frick. And so Sir Charles decorated most of what you know, the grand, sort of more public rooms downstairs, and insisted on great quality in terms of the carving, the kind of Grinling Gibbons-like work. Brief nod to the late David Esterly, who is very much missed. But this is the kind of work which is being created. And what Charles Allam says is what he wants to achieve is that your eye will always go to the art collection, because this is what Frick wanted, so that even in the library, the shelves are low enough that there's room to hang pictures above. But very high quality of work throughout the house. The second floor, and if it's possible to use genders, I think one could say that the first floor tends to be more masculine, and the second floor was originally more feminine. Elsie de Wolf, who's a fairly famous decorator, I don't know if she's known in these parts, but she did the Colony Club. She did quite a lot of work in the early 20th century in New York, writes Frick a letter in which she says, I understand the comfort of women's rooms, the tricks that no mere man, however clever, will ever know. And she gets the job and designs things like, this is Adelaide Frick's bedroom, which no longer exists. Much of what she did was taken apart in the early 1930s when the Frick had an expansion. But so both of these figures had a considerable role in the decorations of the house as we know it. So Frick is busily buying things, and I promise you I am going to show you some decorative arts and ceramics later, so just be a little patient. But people do tend to think of the pictures first at the Frick. And he buys, as I said, what he likes. So he likes portraits. These are 2 wonderful portraits by Van Dyck, of Franz Snyders and his wife. John Mallet was just saying that his mother had a picture of the painting on the left on her desk, which I thought was a wonderful little moment. But so these are, the prosperous animal painter and his wife in Antwerp, about 1618, 1619. Frick ends up buying a total of about 8 Van Dycks. We did an exhibition called The Anatomy of Portraiture on all the different media that Van Dyck used in his portraiture a few years ago at the Frick. He buys a lot of English pictures. We have some great Gainsborough full-length portraits, though this remains one of my favorites. The Mall in St. James's Park with a kind of phalanx of women marching down the center, separating the gossipers on either side. And one of the details that I love are the dairy cows, reminding one that before pasteurization, one had to have cows down in London. But a brilliant sort of small picture by Gainsborough. More English pictures. He loved Turner. This is the Portrait Dieppe of 1827. Kind of mid-career picture by Turner. We did an exhibition 2 years ago on Turner's ports. And of course, Vermeer, Dutch pictures. He ends up buying 3 paintings by Vermeer. But of course, he also buys decorative arts. And what's interesting is he's been focusing mostly on old masters since he comes to New York around 1900. And it's while he's building the house that he begins, it dawns on him that he needs decorative arts. He needs to furnish the house at the same level of quality as the paintings. So almost all the things I'm going to show you, he bought in a 7-year period, really focusing. He had very good people helping him find these things. But so this, for example, is a Secrétaire by Jean-Louis Riesner, first made in 1780 for Marie Antoinette. probably for her Chateau Saint-Cloud. Very touchingly, she was so fond of this, there's a commode en suite with it, that when she was sent to house arrest at the Tuileries in 1790, she asked Reasoner to adapt it to the new rooms. So he made it slightly shorter, made it slightly simpler. She was living with this shortly before she went to the guillotine. Almost exactly the same year, this is 1781, 82, a great table that was made for the Duchesse de Mazarin, designed by the architect Bélanger. The crowning glory of this, however, are the mounts by Pierre Goutier. Our curator of decorative arts, Charlotte Vignon, recently did an exhibition trying to figure out what is really by Goutier, of which this was one of the centerpieces, and you might have seen another version of it that went to the Musée des Arts Décoratifs. So the other sort of stroke of luck, if you will, for Frick is that while he's building the house, the greatest American collector, J.P. Morgan, dies, 1913. And many of Frick's things are in England, they're scattered around, they're brought to the United States. Morgan was a president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art previously, so he has a 2-year-long exhibition of some 4,000 objects from his collection, which you see in the slide on the right. And so it's an opportunity for Frick, who's always admired Morgan. He was competing with Morgan for many of the pictures and works of art that I've shown you, admired his taste, but he insists on cherry-picking the very best. So people like Duveen want to package groups of sort of good, better, best, but Frick says, no, I want to pick each one. So he picks great Italian Renaissance bronzes, Severo da Ravenna on the left, for example, Riccio oil lamp on the right, and the Frick has one of the great collections of Italian Renaissance sculpture, bronze sculpture. Now we've done a series of exhibitions on the subject over the years, and we have another one coming up on Bertoldo in September. But you know, Frick's eye was in on each one of these. He buys a collection of some 40 Limoges enamels. I just picked out a few by Pierre Cortise, Jean Raymond. And he loves them so much that he gives up his personal office in order to have a place to display them. You're seeing it the way it is today, in which we've mixed in Piero della Francesca and some of the early Italian Renaissance pictures that we have. But he gives up his office and builds vitrines, buys a complete set of French Renaissance furniture, which, not surprisingly, most of it's not French Renaissance, but it's hard to find real French Renaissance furniture. So this is the kind of thing that Frick loved. So Duveen enters the story. He's previously worked for Frick at his country house, and now he really sets his eye on Frick, particularly through the sale of things from Morgan's estate. I highly recommend a book that's just come out by our curator of decorative arts, published this month by Charlotte Vignon, which is called The Duveen Brothers and the Market for Decorative Arts, 1860 to 1940. It's the first. There have been, of course, a number of biographies of Duveen, but Charlotte has been working on this as sort of dissertation at the Sorbonne, but it's the first study that's based on the archival records of the firm that are now available through the Getty. So a very revealing book about the influence of this family on the great collectors of New York, and ultimately many of those collections entered American museums. So here's an example of Duveen at his best. Our Fragonard room, called The Progress of Love, belonged to Morgan. In fact, he had it at his house in Princess Gate at one point. It was done in 2 different campaigns, first in 1772 for Madame du Barry at her Chateau at Louveciennes, and when she rejected them, he took them to his hometown, the south of France, at Grasse, where he got another commission and added more pictures on. Duveen brokered the deal. Frick paid $1.5 million for this, most he ever spent on a work of art. But what's interesting is Duveen sold it at cost. He made no profit on it. And why? Because he knew that if Frick was happy, he could sell him everything else in the room to furnish it at enormous profit, which he did. So this wonderful Sèvres sailing ship and garniture, Frick bought for $100,000, for example, in 1915. Great French furniture, great marble table piece. So both men were happy. Frick was not profligate with his money, but he wanted quality and he was willing to pay for it to get it. So Henry dies 1919. His will makes it clear that he wants this to become a public institution after the death of his wife, who dies in 1931. So Helen Clay Frick, the daughter, steps in. She becomes the head of the acquisitions committee at the Frick and continues to buy, and she buys very well. So consider two pictures bought in 1927. This Duccio, the temptation of Christ. The devil has tempted Christ with all the kingdoms of the world, which you see as miniature cities below, which Christ has rejected, and he's casting the devil out. This is one of the few panels from the great Sienese Maestà for the cathedral in Siena, double-sided altarpiece about the life of Christ and the life of the Virgin, and one of the few Duccios in the United States, great painting. Also the same year, this great Ingres portrait, Comtesse d'Aussonville, wonderful, intelligent woman whose ancestors, Madame de Staël, writer, biographer, brilliant picture by this great French painter of 1845. So the Frick is continuing to acquire. It invites John Russell Pope, who's the architect who builds the National Gallery in Washington, to make an addition. So many people don't realize that the Frick they visit today is actually two buildings put together. The garden court, which many of you may have sat in to get a respite from the hubbub of New York, used to be an open-air courtyard, which was filled in. So John Russell Pope basically expanded the Frick and made it more open to a larger public. And in the beginning, the Frick was very nervous of letting all the public in, to the point that you had to travel only down these narrow little corridors that were stanchioned off. So nobody was allowed to get near works of art. As you can see in the lower slide, we've done away with all the stanchions. And one of the great virtues of the Frick is that you really can come up and closely look at a work of art. We have very few barriers that prevent you from really having a direct experience with a work of art. So we've continued to acquire not so many paintings. This is one which was a gift to us a few years ago from one of our trustees, Pemmy Frick. Actually belonged to Henry Clay Frick, but descended in the family, and I'm very grateful that she gave it to us. It's one of only two portraits, self-portraits by Murillo, the great Spanish mid-17th century painter. The only other self-portrait is a later one. It's in the National Gallery in London. We did an exhibition with the National Gallery a couple of years ago, so you might have seen it, and the dealers Colle Cortes very graciously found this period gilded frame for us, Spanish frame, as we know that it originally was in a gilded frame. So I promised you some decorative arts. He does buy, mostly through Duveen, a set of about 60 pieces of Chinese porcelain, quite good. He buys 50, 60 pieces of Sèvres porcelain. We saw several other examples yesterday of this. It was designed by Duplessis about 1759, this mast sailing ship Potpourri that has two vases en suite. So a good collection, not a huge collection, but a very fine collection of Sèvres porcelain. His son, Childs Frick, you saw him in the kilt a while ago, grows up to become a great supporter of digs in the west of America for dinosaur bones. That's his passion. There's actually a wing at the American Museum of Natural History named after him. He has given several 100,000 fines to that museum. But he loved Chinese blue and white. So when he died in 1966, a collection of some 230 pieces of Chinese blue and white porcelain entered the Frick's collection. And we've been building on ceramics in recent years. I'm sure many of you in this room knew the late Henry Arnhold, who just passed away last summer to many of our unhappiness. Henry was a larger-than-life, wonderful man. And so he has one of the great collections of Meissen porcelain, which he left in bequest to us. And because of his death, it's now entered the collection. And he allowed us to pick 134 pieces from his collection, which you may know was cataloged by Maureen Cassidy Geiger some decade ago. So we picked things like this great bustard of 1732, Kirchner, but it has quite an amazing range. For example, we were talking about Japanese bird cage vases yesterday in Henry's collection, and now we have two Meissen examples that were done that Henry was very proud of because they used to belong to King Umberto I. We currently have an exhibition of French faience that belongs to a man named Sid Knafel. His collection was recently cataloged by Camille Leprince, who was here earlier. I don't know if he's still here. And Sid has some 300 pieces of French faience, one of the great collections in the world. And again, Sid very graciously allowed us to choose what we wanted from his collection. So we've picked 75 objects out of the 300 so objects that he's got. It's currently on view in this gallery. And it covers the range from the introduction of Maiolica painters to Lyon in the 1560s through Nevers in the 17th century to Marseille Moussière at the end of the 18th century. So we were able to kind of represent this tradition quite fully at a very high level. Some very interesting pieces. This is almost 3 feet high. The ewer from Nevers of about 1680, which he bought about 25 years ago. And just a year ago, he found the basin, which almost certainly is the basin that goes for it. So a wonderful collector and a great collection that will fit very well with us at the Frick. We also were given a group of objects of Dupaquier porcelain from the Sullivan collection. They too allowed us to choose from their collection. I was there at the beginning in a sense because I was the head of a department of decorative arts at the Art Institute of Chicago when I was the Eloise W. Martin curator, and Eloise's 2 daughters wanted to make a gift of a work of art to the Art Institute. With Ganetta Zaleka, who was curator then, we put together a group of 3 pieces of Dupaquier, and Melinda Sullivan loved it, to the point that she's gone on to put together what I think is probably the finest collection of Dupaquier, and certainly deserves credit for putting together the monumental tomes, all in color, of this wonderful factory. But again, she allowed us to choose a group of objects that represents the factory, that relates to the Meissen that we have. Here you're looking at a tankard where the handle is actually a cooper, so he's wearing the leather apron of a barrel maker as he's clutching it. And we have a group, a tureen from the 1727 Dupaquier service in the State Hermitage Museum that we saw examples of earlier. So a very good but small group of decorative arts. We were given, some 20 years ago, a collection of clocks that belonged to a man named Winthrop Kelly Eady, fascinating figure, friend of Andy Warhol, denizen of the night, but when he was focusing, he was a great connoisseur and collector of clocks, and gave us things like this wonderful Boule clock from about 1690, some 40 examples that make us a great collector, a significant collection of clocks. And then most recently, we're in the process of being given the finest private collection in the world of portrait metals, so that run from Pisanello through David d'Angers, so from the mid-15th century through the late 19th century. I'm just showing you a mix of things from Pisanello to Varin to Reinhardt, other German, English, Dutch. We've just published a massive 650-page catalog of the entire Schur collection, and it's coming to us in parts over the next several years, but we're very grateful that we were going to have this because it fits very well with our Italian Renaissance bronzes, for example. So as you can see, we've been sort of collecting collections. We've always aspired to have the very best. We also, when possible, ask that we allowed to choose, which, as you know, is not always easy with a collector who doesn't necessarily want that activity. But I'm very grateful to the collectors who've made this possible, that we've been able to amplify, particularly the decorative arts at the Frick. So where are we going to put them all? The collections of the Frick have more than doubled since we opened to the public in 1935. But we've only added 600 square feet in those 85 years of gallery space. So we need more space to show our collection. And like many old houses, we have a lot of other needs. It's almost impossible to get a wheelchair into it. Our auditorium is too small. Our conservation room is minuscule. We need a better exhibition space so we don't have to take down the permanent collection to show it. We need spaces for seminars, for education. We need better spaces for the visitors so they don't have to stand outside when they're waiting to get into the Frick. And then finally, the infrastructure. Our skylights are leaking, 100 years, 80 years old. Our electrical system dates to 1935. Our air conditioning system and heating system is on its last legs. So it's time for the Frick to add some much needed space. The challenge is that everybody loves the Frick, and we don't want to do harm to it. So most of what we're building is underground, and very judiciously building above ground. So when you return in 4 years' time, and I hope you come sooner, you'll see the Frick that you know and love. But we'll have more spaces that we need to continue to do well the activities in the arts that we love to do, particularly exhibitions, which I think we've been getting better and better at. So one of the centerpieces of this is to open the second floor, which has things like, this is my office, for example, which I'm going to give up for the cause. So we'll have a series of spaces that were the family bedrooms and private rooms, which we're going to turn into gallery space. It'll be open to the public, so people will be able to see how the whole house functioned, both its more private and more public sides. We'll have a specialized gallery for metals. We'll have a specialized gallery for ceramics. And we're still working out what's going to go where, which is a wonderful challenge for our curatorial department. So from the construction that I described, you may understand that we're going to have to close. The infrastructure alone is so pervasive that we have no choice but to protect the collection, to move it. So I was going around town trying to find a home for us while we were under construction. And I hoped maybe for a couple of galleries at the most, but I ended up, oh, and I'm sorry, I meant to show you this. This is, you may know this is the Boucher room, which was Adelaide Frick's dressing room originally. So it was here originally, where my office was. This was changed to look as it is in the 1930s. So we're going to bring the Boucher room back where it was. We can't recreate everything because much of it was lost, but in a few points we can sort of bring back what was there so the public can see how it worked. And so the solution to where we're going to go is rather surprising to many people. If you had to sit down and imagine two of the most disparate buildings in New York, you might choose these two, even though they're only built 50 years apart. The Marcel Breuer building, which was built in 1966 for the Whitney. You may know that the Metropolitan Museum has been leasing it for 7 years. They've done some wonderful shows there, but they've lost a ton of money. And we can move in because we're basically just substituting for what we would be doing anyway. What will our collection look like? We don't know. They've done, the Met did a couple of old master shows. This is one called Unfinished some years ago. You can't fight brutalism. You sort of have to work with it. So we're going to show on the second, third, and fourth floors. It will be very interesting. We'll be able to do some things we've never done before. We'll learn from our collection. I think our public will be very interested. We'll be very interested. And 4 years from now, we'll move back where everything will be much the same, except the skylights will be fixed. We'll have better state-of-the-art lighting. We'll have better conservation facilities. We'll have better public facilities. But we will continue to be the Frick that you know and love. Thank you.